So, one of the other things I want to touch on, in part because I've had many conversations about this subject, although probably not in the way that we'll discuss it, is psychedelics. So, psychedelics have become much more culturally prominent recently. They've been sort of revitalized in certain ways. There's lots of interesting scientific research going on with them. But, as people know, either from direct experience or from reading about other people's direct experience, psychedelics have very interesting and powerful effects on the contents of consciousness. Oftentimes, you take a psychedelic, especially at a high dose, and you experience things that you didn't even know were on the menu before. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the phenomenology of psychedelics in connection with some of the things we were talking about earlier. What are we learning about what's going on in the brain when someone ingests a psychedelic? And how does that start to relate to some of the things we were talking about previously in terms of the reducing valve that the brain acts as, to use Huxley's term?
So you want me to talk about the phenomenological side of things, not the neuroscientific side of things?
Well, why don't we try and take them in sequence there? So
Okay.
what kinds of things tend to happen in a psychedelic experience, and then how does that tie to some of these neuroscientific findings?
Yeah, I've done many psychedelic experiences, and I consider myself lucky to have only started doing them when I was already in my 30s as a mature adult. Otherwise, I don't know what I would have made of it. I'm not sure they would have been productive and useful. They're certainly not for fun. It's a hard curriculum. It's hard work. It's not something you do for fun. And if you do that for fun, then you're not really doing it. You're taking a very light dose if you think you can go to a concert after taking psilocybin. So you don't know what a real psilocybin trance is if you're doing it that way. I've done a few. That doesn't give me the right to say that I know the truth, the truth about psychedelics, because once you've been there, you know that that's an infinite world. But my takeaways are the following. There is a lot more about my own inner mentation, a world of rich imagery, rich cognitive associations, rich feelings, rich imagination, that is completely beyond metacognitive access in an ordinary state of consciousness. Stuff that I do not know I have in me. And I would never have known if I hadn't done a psychedelic trip. I would only have known that during the process of death, which does the same thing psychedelics do, reduce and impair brain activity. So a lot more has been revealed to me explicitly about my own inner fantasizing, my own inner needs that are fulfilled through fantasy, my own inner yearnings, how much I love certain people, for instance, becomes very evident. What I actually yearn for in my life, as opposed to my little egoic plan of the achievements I need to have in the coming 10 years. Psychedelics show you what you really, really want, how you really, really are from within, how you really, really feel. And much of this stuff is stuff that we rather not know. We don't want to know that stuff about ourselves. It makes us feel inappropriate or ashamed, makes us fear ourselves. There is a monster within, and psychedelics can show you that monster as well. So that's one. The other thing I think it showed me is that certain aspects of the psychedelic experience are way too alien to be mine. They aren't mine. Are they fantasies? Yes, but they are not my fantasies. They are the inner mentation of the field of subjectivity around me. They are the noumena. They are part of what nature is in essence, as opposed to how nature presents itself to me through my sense organs. They are the thing in itself, part of the thing in itself. And the thing in itself going on out there is weird. It's the difference between to perceive nature and to be nature. And psychedelics give you a hint into what it is to be nature beyond yourself, what it is like to be nature just beyond just yourself. And it's mighty weird. And at the same time, extraordinarily familiar. And that's a very characteristic cognitive dissonance in a deep psychedelic trance, that the thing that is most alien, most anxiety-inducing, most discombobulating, at the same time, it's the thing that's closest to you, the most familiar, the most primordial, that which you knew at the very beginning of time and you've forgotten, that which is the real you, and at the same time, so incredibly alien. Now, that stuff is not mine as Bernardo Kastrup. That stuff is the recognition of nature's mind through my cognitive apparatus, but that stuff is not me. And you may ask me, well, how do you know it's not you? Well, go there yourself. Come back and tell me that that stuff was you. It surpasses any conceivable notion of a personal self. It surpasses all of our categories, all of them. So that's the second thing. And the third takeaway message, and the most important, in my opinion, from my psychedelic experiences, is that mind concocts its own sense of reality. You can be in a psychedelic trance, and in that trance, you are in the Pleiades talking to aliens, and you have a feeling of hyper reality. You cannot help but tell yourself, this is actually happening. It feels so much more concrete, vivid, self-consistent, continuous, reliable, palpable than ordinary reality. It feels much more real than real. It's what people usually say. If you have your friend's trip, they come back saying, wow, man, far out, that was more real than real. Yes, that's the sense. But were you physically in a reality outside mind, talking to aliens in the Pleiades outside mind? No, you were not. If somebody were next to you, you would be lying on that bed all along. So what tells you is that our sense of reality is not objective. It doesn't come from outside mind. Our sense of reality is endogenous. Therefore, the real insight from the psychedelic trance is not that the trance is real in the sense of being outside of mind. It's not. It's a creation of mind. But what it's telling you is that this, right now, is a creation of mind as well. That your sense of reality right now, your feeling of the continuity, the fact that the world seems to be autonomous and independent of your willing and your wishes, all this stuff that seems to ground our sense of reality, that's all mental stuff too. It's not your mind as an individual human being, but this too is mental. This too is a kind of trance. We are on drugs all the time, and you don't need to be on trance owning psilocybin or dimethyltryptamine. You can have a trance on our main neurotransmitter.
Talking about glutamate?
No.
Serotonin?
We are tripping on serotonin right now. So no, we are always on drugs. So this too is a kind of trip. I think that is the key takeaway message from the psychedelic trip. Not psychedelic gnosis, not to come back and say, I spoke to a real deity outside mind. No. Don't get taken in by your own bullshit. Because under psychedelics, you have no defense against your mind's perpetual attempts to deceive itself. That's what mind does. Mind communicates to itself by creating deceptive imagery. It's the language of mind. It's what it does because it is what it is. So you're not escaping that in a psychedelic trip. But what you can conclude is, shit, that's what mind is doing right now.
And so there's some interesting results that have, started to percolate up into our awareness around what the brain is actually doing in the psychedelic state versus the normal waking state. What are some of the more interesting findings that you've seen so far, and how does that tie back into some of our discussion?
The most robust and the largest observation so far, which has been repeatedly observed across psychedelic substances and across measurement apparatuses. By substances, I mean studies were done with psilocybin, which turns into psilocin, DMT, LSD, ketamine, and I think a couple of others. But the main studies were made with these four substances, and measurement apparatuses were fMRI, MEG, and EEG. So a variety of substances and a variety of measurement apparatuses have led to the same conclusion: psychedelics always and only reduce brain activity. They don't increase brain activity beyond the error margin of measurement anywhere in the brain. That's the largest effect of psychedelics. There are other very minor effects as well, which the literature is now focusing on because they sort of remain consistent with physicalist intuitions. But the main effect is the opposite of what we would have expected. Before 2012, you would have asked any neuroscientists, what do psychedelics do in your brain? Everybody would say, oh, they light up your brain like a Christmas tree. Both levels would go beyond the charts. You would be consuming a lot of oxygen in your brain because it would be lit up in order to generate the imagery of the trance, which is the richest, most intense, most significant experiences of one's life. Actually, research done at I'm failing with remembering the details, but research has shown that it consistently scores amongst the 5 most intense, rich, memorable, significant experiences of one's life. One psychedelic trance, let alone a whole series of them. And we thought, the brain lights up like a Christmas tree. It's the opposite. Your brain is less active than when you're dreaming, a lot less active than when you are asleep. It is the best, safe model of death we have, in the sense that it really brings your brain activity down without killing you. And then you get metabolic rebound after you metabolize the substance. Then blood oxygen levels in the brain increase a lot because your brain is starved. But that's the main, by far the largest and most consistent effect: reduction of brain activity.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting observation. It's also, I think, interesting to think about in terms of this connection between the psychedelic experience and death that many people have drawn throughout time. And one of the particular psychedelics I wanted to ask you about, based on one of my own experiences, was 5-Methoxy Dmt. So I'll briefly describe an experience I had and how I start to connect some of the dots here. And when I had this experience, which I spoke about in the very first episode of the podcast, it was not the first psychedelic I'd ever tried. I had been very experienced at this time, but 5-MeO-DMT had a very different character to it than anything else I had tried. And very briefly, I'll just say that for the tens of minutes that you're in this trance, it leads to what I would describe as a very undifferentiated experience. Meaning that, as opposed to taking other doses of other substances, instead of seeing a bunch of crazy stuff and things are moving and things are happening, everything goes away. And yet somehow there's still this awareness present. And so, with eyes closed, it's sort of just dark. And with eyes open, it was a pure white light. And you just immediately kind of have this undifferentiated experience of light. There are no shapes. There are no concepts. There's no mental activity happening except this sort of what I would just call pure awareness. And then as you relax out of the state, that light starts to coalesce into simple colors, and then they start to sort of morph and move a little bit. And then gradually over the course of 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, it coalesces into what eventually just becomes you looking at the room again in the normal way that you do. But the first experience I had with it, when I started thinking again, tens of minutes later, my mind immediately went to, wow, that sounds a lot like every time I've heard someone describe a near-death experience and they say, I saw the light, or something like that. Or anytime I've heard, someone really into Buddhism or meditation say, talk about samadhi, or the sort of pure, undifferentiated state that you can reach which is usually taken to be the kind of pinnacle of meditative practice. And it struck me that I had this sort of undifferentiated experience. All of the distinctions, all of the concepts, all of the colors, all of the shapes went away temporarily. And I was just left with this pure and very, very strong feeling of bliss, is maybe the best word that you could use to describe it. And it was very interesting. I would love to know what's going on in the brain, but I wonder if 5-MeO in particular is causing these kind of reductions in brain activity. And before I get your comment on this, Bernardo, I do want to tie that back to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, where a lot of what the brain is doing when it's metabolizing and doing what the brain does, it is drawing distinctions between things. It's making sensory discriminations. It's building the concepts that allow us to label and discriminate between different entities that we perceive as objects and other things. And all of that goes away in this particular experience. And, I would love to get your comment on that, or hear about any experience you might have with 5-MeO.
I didn't have any experience with 5-MeO. No. The frog business is not appetizing for me. I don't know whether you can get that synthesized legally in the Netherlands. Only in a research context, I would imagine.
I'm not sure about the Netherlands in particular, but depending on the jurisdiction, Yeah, there is synthetic 5-MeO DMT, and it sometimes is available for research purposes, and sometimes it's available for anyone.
I never tried 5-MeO. I did have an experience of the smell is the same as what you just described, but I had that experience with psilocybin. Psilocybin is a strange psychedelic in the sense that you never know what's going to come. It can be radically different from one week to the next, from one phase of your life to another. But there was one experience I had with psilocybin in which I came back, and the only cultural reference I had that would get anywhere near what I had experienced was the Buddhist void, the void of Buddhism, in which there is only mind, but mind isn't excited. In other words, there's only potentiality, but there's nothing beyond that. And I was in that void, and it's a very non-claustrophobic void in the sense that it's unlimited. It's not constrained by space and time at all. It's a moment of eternity, if one wants to put it that way. And when I started coming back from that, which I usually call the re-entry from that particular experience was the worst aspect of a psychedelic experience I have ever experienced. People talk about, the lift off, which is ego dissolution. That can be very hard, but you grow into it. You become used to it to a point that it doesn't feel bad at all anymore. You're so ready to let go of all of your shit that when it goes, you don't grasp onto it. You don't try to hold on to it. So I got to a point where I was used to ego dissolution and didn't feel bad at all. On the contrary, it felt like a great relief. It's letting go of all of your anxieties, all of your problems. It all dissolves. Only what is really important and really real stay. But the re-entry from this particular experience of the void, I don't know even how to describe that. Imagine you're being crushed by a truck, except that this truck is as heavy as the moon and it's crushing you for 100,000 years and you're not dying. The level of claustrophobia, of reconnecting with the notion of time. I remember having the image of a calendar with the 5 days of the week and the 2 days of weekend. I remember coming back to that image and thinking, my God, no, I cannot live ruled by this little thing called a week. My life, my existence cannot be ruled by this. This is so incredibly claustrophobic. I couldn't breathe. And I had these images coming back. I drive a black Volkswagen Passat, a large sedan, totally black. And I had this image of this little thing that was me inside the black box. And it needed to be in that black box to have different experiences. In other words, to go from one place to another. So you couldn't have different experiences by just allowing experiences to flow through you. You had to get into that little black metal box. And that was so crushing. And so crushing as well. It took me, I don't know, 2 or 3 days to accept life again after that. Because when I came back to this, I was so crushed. I was so depressed. I was so irate with the notion of being alive. Like inside this little box in space and time, that I was dysfunctional for a couple of days. And that was one of the trips that sort of sobered me up. Like, oh, I have to be careful with this stuff. The curriculum is very hard. This is no joke. These are hard life lessons, and they are as hard as they come. It's very tough love.
What kind of dose was that with?
Between 5 and 6 dried grams.
Okay, so you did the heroic dose.
I've done more. I've done 8.
Wow, that's quite a lot. So one of the things I do want to talk about here is,
but I'm very hard-headed, Nick. 8 for me probably is 4 for the regular tripper. My baseline consciousness is very hard to move. It's very hard to displace it.
Hmm. So one of the things I do want to talk to you about is the phenomenology of death and how you think about it, given the frame that you think in. So I want to say, one of the things I've talked to people about before is my 5-MeO experience. And one of the ways I start to think about that myself, but also help other people think about it who haven't had the experience, is in the following way. And again, naturally, I think as a biologist. So an experience we've all had is going out on a cold day. You're not wearing a jacket and it's very cold outside. What happens as you walk outside and time passes? Well, some parts of your body start to get pain and start to get very cold and start to get frostbite before other parts, right? So your body has baked inside of it an order of operations that happens. It knows, okay, well, if we only have so much heat to keep the body alive, make sure that your brain and your heart and your organs get that heat, and siphon it away from the tips of your fingers, the tips of your toes, the tips of your nose first. So the body knows, so to speak, and it will allow the least important things for survival to shut off first and preserve the ones that are absolutely essential as long as it can. So when we think in that way and we think about metabolism, now think about the brain just decaying organically as part of a slow and gradual natural death process, right? Some parts of your brain and the brainstem are controlling your heartbeat, they're controlling your breathing. If those go offline, you're done. But all of the fancier stuff, so to speak, that your cortex is doing, creating your ability to have language, to discriminate objects based on the sensory inputs you're getting, to make logical deductions, all of this stuff is not strictly necessary. You can lay there and breathe and keep your heart beating without doing those things. And so I wonder if, in the organic death process that people experience in old age, I would suspect, and it's answerable in principle, right, that those higher order networks in the brain doing the fancier stuff are going to shut down first. And the things that will generally shut down last, if you're having this kind of slow death, are the ones that are absolutely essential for respiration and heartbeat and things like this. And if that's the case, and if what much of those higher order networks are doing are all of this fancy stuff that we take for granted, us talking together, making distinctions between objects in my visual field and so forth,
doing science and philosophy.
And science and philosophy. All of those things would start to go offline while the absolutely essential survival functions were preserved. And you would eventually, perhaps, I think, come to some experience not unlike what you just described, where things feel void, but the brain is still alive for some period of time. And, I've always wondered and speculated if things like 5-MeO or things like these high-dose psilocybin experiences are essentially putting your neurophysiology into a place that's not unlike what it does when things organically wind down at the time of death. And perhaps that's related to why many near-death experiences have these similarities to the types of experiences people have on psychedelics. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that and then just talk about death from the perspective of analytical idealism.
I think what you said is entirely reasonable. It doesn't sound implausible at all to my ears. I mean, a psychedelic is not a threat to your life like cold is. So it's curious why they have this effect, why they reduce brain activity as if you were dying. So I'm not sure why that happens that way, but clearly it does happen. And I do think it's the best safe model of death we have. I mean, short of going to like the flatliners did in the movie, that you stop your heart and hope to be resuscitated, with psychedelics, your heart never stops, but your brain largely does. That's a good model of death. Now, from an analytic idealist perspective, the normally function, metabolizing body and brain, ordinary brain activity, all these things are what a strong dissociative process in the mind of nature looks like. So they're directly correlated. One is the appearance of the other. And of course, life wants to survive. That's what evolution tells us, that the organisms that we have today are the ones that are best capable of staying alive. So in the language of analytic idealism, it's a natural thing that alters once formed want to survive. They want to stay as alters. Why? Because the causal nexus of nature would favor the alters that do, as opposed to the alters that don't. It's not like there is a law decreed by some agent in nature saying this shall happen thus. No, it's just what happens to happen. And we understand why it happens like that. Now, if an ordinary, normal, healthy, metabolizing body and brain are what a dissociative process looks like, then death, the end of that body and brain, is what the end of dissociation looks like. So, right, if the body is the image of dissociation, then the end of the body implies, logically, the end of the dissociation. Now, how would that feel phenomenologically from a first-person perspective? We think that death implies the end of consciousness. But we know now that many of the states which we consider unconscious are not unconscious at all. Syncope is not unconscious. You can have rich visual imagery during the time you are unresponsive, psychedelics, trance states, the choking game. I mean, the list is endless. That we know that states in which we are unresponsive are accompanied by rich inner life. So I think the same applies to death. Because death is the end of the dissociation. From a first-person perspective, what is experienced is an enrichment. You cognitively reassociate with your immediate cognitive environment from which you were dissociated just before death. And to put it in colloquial language, you remember things you didn't know anymore. You will have a sense of identity that spans a much larger area than just your body. Your inner imagery will become a lot richer than your living human fantasizing could ever be. It's a reintegration into a broader cognitive context, which could be experienced as something overwhelming. Imagine if you remember the memories of the universe coming from being a little human being. Of course, it won't last long. It's like waking up. Waking up is the end of a dissociative process. When you wake up, your dream avatar is toast. It's dead. But it's the same you. It's just that you thought you were the dream avatar, but you never were. It's the same you that wakes up. And then you remember the memories of your life, which you didn't remember when you were the dream avatar. You were dissociated from the aspects of your mind that did the rest of the dream and had the rest of your memories and ideas and wishes and fears and fantasies and all that good stuff, which all comes back to you the moment you wake up. I would expect death to be something like that to the power of, 100. In other words, it's scary stuff. I am afraid.
Yeah, I mean, even the term ego death that people use in the context of psychedelics, sort of gets at how jarring the experience can be. If you're coming up on a large dose of psilocybin, ego death corresponds basically to some patterns of activity in the brain that are associated with your feelings of individuation, and those are going away. And a lot of people experience that as, oh, my body is actually dying, even though it isn't in fact dying. And it can be frightening if you try and fight it. And it can have this very liberating feeling if you just sort of relax into it. And I wonder if, a lot of the metaphors that we typically get in religious traditions of heaven and hell, or, Huxley famously wrote another essay called Heaven and Hell, that, the difference, those aren't two places you go. There are two types of experiences you can have in a state like this, depending on your orientation to it.
I would love to think that this is the case, that hell is ego dissolution, because then there is nothing to worry about. I mean, you've been there a few times like me. After a while, ego death is no longer an issue. Mm-hmm. It's not hard anymore because you don't fight it. And if you don't fight it, it has no energy. It doesn't come to get you. It's just the first time when you think you are actually going to disappear because you think you are your ego. So when your ego goes, when that little knot of associations, that the default mode network in the brain, when that begins to unravel, you think, my God, that's me. And I'm going to go. No. You are the thing that is observing that dissolution. Once you've been through that gauntlet a few times, it's no longer a gauntlet. So I don't think that's it. That's certainly not my reason for being afraid of death. My ego will dissolve and I'll glad shed it. I'll gladly let my personal identity go because it's so claustrophobic. I just don't feel claustrophobic all the time because I get used to it. But you go to the void and you come back and you go like, this is not a pleasant state, this ego stuff. So I'm pretty okay with that, but I have had trips that I could describe as equally cathartic and hellish. And the difference between pleasure and pain disappears in those experiences. There isn't that duality anymore. That you can only talk about intensity. I had an experience once. It was a high dose trip and went deep in. It was not only high dose. I was wearing a mind machine. I had done breathing exercises. I controlled my diet for a week before that trip. It was when I thought, gloves are off. I'm going to go as deep into this rabbit hole as I can go. I was on holidays. So I had read billions of papers, a lot of papers I had read in anticipation. I had my doctor to whom I told what I was going to do. I had him give me an EKG, ECG, the heart.
EKG for the heart.
Yeah, for the heart, and a check of my liver function, because I wanted to make sure I would come back from that. I went really deep in, and after you pass ego dissolution, after you pass the fantastic visual hallucinations and the aliens and the parallel universes and all that, and then you pass the void, and you keep going, and there is something at the base of the fountain. There is something at the very root of mind, the very root of existence. It is the ultimate. Now, you understand that whatever I say now is nonsense because it cannot be captured in words. So I'll not talk about it. I'll talk around it. And I'll basically hand wave, trying to give you at least a smell of more or less what that felt like. At that fountain, it was like a multi-hyperdimensional fractal pattern was unfolding. It came from a singularity and nothing, and it began to unfold. And it unfolds based only on itself. There is never anything coming from the outside. It self-unfolds. But the richness of this unfolding is beyond anything that can be conceived in an ordinary state of consciousness. And at the same time, it's nothing. That unfolding comes from nothing. In the inside, there is nothing. And out of the nothing comes all of that. And at some point, witnessing that, I was still telling myself narratives. It was one of those trips in which we maintain some level of metacognition, amazingly enough. And at some point, I was telling myself, this is going to fry my mind. A human mind cannot confront this. In other words, be aware of it and survive. It is too entropic. The diversity of states is so massive that you cannot maintain any sense of structural or dynamical integrity. Not that it's random in the sense that neuroscience is trying to study psychedelics now. No, the entropic brain hypothesis, entropy levels rise. What they mean is noise, unstructured noise. That's not it at all. It was immensely structured, but structured in such a way that the diversity of states that would arise from that continuously unfolding structure, to become acquainted with that was to die, was to lose your internal integrity, to lose everything that defines you as a mind. And that was death. That was real death, not ego death. That is the death of in a frying pan. It's really going to blow you to pieces if you maintain your attention on that.
Yeah,
and my fear is that hell and heaven are both that. That is it. That's the fountainhead. It's both hell and heaven. And I understand how and why it can be both, because it's simultaneously terrifying and beyond delightful. It's cathartic. it's of a level of beauty that even the word beauty is like, we need another word. Mm-hmm. That's cosmic beauty. It's beyond anything.
Yeah, well,
and it kills you if you stare at it.
Strangely enough, I feel like I know exactly what you are talking around here, because in my 5-MeO experience, and again, talking around it, it was quite similar. I think there was this thing, and only this thing. There was no even perception of myself being there to see it. But somehow, this thing that somehow didn't have a shape was vibrating or shaking with such intensity that it felt like not only every scene of experience that I was about to come back into was coming from it, but every possible scene of every possible experience that could be was just sort of violently shaking out of this thing. And again, the word thing doesn't mean like a shape that I saw. It was just this sort of, I mean, it was just almost just like seeing light, and it was just like everything was wiggling out of it.
If I you will understand it because you've been there. I see it, but people who have never been there will not understand it. So for the sake of those who can sense the smell, the reason the fires of hell burn you is because they are unspeakably beautiful. They are heavenly.
The fires of hell are heavenly.
And that's why they burn, because they are unspeakably beautiful. It's a beauty that dissolves you.